This is a story set in Lakewood, Colorado, during a zombie outbreak and a municipal water crisis that trapped me, a night shift operator at a suburban water treatment plant, as I tried to keep the drinking water clean, the pumps running, and the plant secure until the county opened a safe corridor. The first time I died, I did it on the filter bay catwalk with a flashlight in one hand and the control key in the other. I had been working the night shift at the Lakewood plant for just over 6 years, long enough to know the smell of the place by room. The intake building smelled like cold water and wet concrete. The chemical corridor smelled like bleach, metal, and the faint sweet bite of polymer. The lab smelled like coffee left too long on a hot plate and glassware that had been rinsed too many times. The generator room smelled like diesel, dust, and hot insulation when the load climbed. Most people thought a water plant was a set of tanks and pipes. It was more than that. It was a rhythm. The raw water pump house pulled from the reservoir at the edge of the suburbs. The screens caught sticks and leaves. The clarifiers settled out the grit. The filters polished the water until the turbidity dropped low enough for distribution. The clear well held the finished water before the pumps pushed it into the city grid. Everything had a number. Flow rate, chlorine residual, turbidity, pressure, temperature. If a number drifted, I was the one who had to decide whether it was a real problem or just another tired instrument lying to me at 3 in the morning. That night, the numbers started lying before the world did. The first call came from Priya in the lab. Her voice was calm, which was how I knew she was worried. She told me the residual on the finished water sample had dipped more than it should have for that hour, and asked whether I had changed the feed set point. I told her no. She said the SCADA trend was showing a small drop in pressure on the north distribution line too. I remember looking through the window at the clarifier room and thinking that the plant felt too quiet. A quiet plant is usually fine. A quiet plant at 2 in the morning when the numbers are drifting is not fine. I grabbed my flashlight, my key ring, and the clipboard with the overnight checks and started down the catwalk toward the filter bay. The control room monitor had a service alert blinking on the left side. Nothing dramatic. Just a door contact at the maintenance corridor and a low-level motion flag in the loading yard. The security guard on duty had radioed earlier that a delivery truck was late and I was waiting for the driver because he had the replacement test reagents I needed for the morning shift. When I reached the catwalk, the service hatch was already open a little. That was wrong. I knew I had latched it myself 10 minutes before. The strip light over the filter bay buzzed and flickered. I heard boots scraping metal. I heard somebody breathing hard in the maintenance corridor. Then I heard a voice that I knew from the day shift, one of the outside contractors, calling my name in a strained, flat tone that did not fit his personality at all. "Gabe, open the inner door." It sounded like a request. It was not. I stepped closer to the hatch and put my hand on the handle. That was when the infected came around the stacked cleaning bins. It was one of the maintenance contractors, or it had been. His face looked gray under the strip light, and his eyes were red in a way that made me think first of fever and then of bloodshot exhaustion and then of nothing I wanted to name. He moved faster than I expected at that distance. Not a sprint. Just a hard, direct lunge, the kind of movement a person makes when they are not thinking about the consequences of impact. I had time to twist and not enough time to escape. My shoulder hit the rail. The flashlight fell and spun a white beam across the grating. The infected grabbed my sleeve and dragged me half a step toward the service opening. I remember the metal edge biting into my palm. I remember the smell of wet fabric and chlorine on the contractor's jacket. I remember the one clean thought that came to me in the middle of all of it. I had trusted the sound of a human voice without checking the camera feed. The bite came just below my wrist. Then the world went gray and narrow and cold. When I woke again, I was sitting in the control room chair with my coffee cup half full and the wall clock reading 4:13 a.m. I did not move for almost a minute. The room was warm, the monitor glow was steady, and the generator hum outside was still in its normal cycle. On the wall screen, the plant log showed the date as 1 week earlier. I checked my wrist. No bite. No blood. I checked the calendar on the workstation, then the inbox, then the overnight alarms. Same weather advisory. Same maintenance notes, same early chatter from the hospital network about unusual assaults near the transit center, but not yet the full panic that would come later. Not a dream, not a blackout, a reset. I had already seen how the first ending went. That was enough to make the morning feel like someone had set a live wire on the desk beside me, By dawn, I was counting the plant like a person counts exits in a building fire. The plant had 3 major zones that mattered once things went bad: the intake and screen building on the raw water side, the treatment hall with the clarifiers, filters, chemical feed, and sample bench, and the control room wing, which held the office, lab, records closet, break area, and the narrow corridor that led to the generator room. Beyond that sat the parts storage, the chlorine cage, the back gate, and the small service lot where deliveries came in. I knew the layout because I had walked it every night for years. That knowledge was not comforting. It was useful. Useful was better. If the suburb went down, the plant would become a tiny island of clean pressure in a city full of fear. If the power dropped, the generator room would matter more than the office. If the chemicals ran short, the lab would become the place where hope either stayed real or turned into guesswork. I wrote all of that on a legal pad and made a list of what I would need before the week was over. Water, food, batteries, paper logs, spare gloves, masks, sanitizer, headlamps, fuel stabilizer, extra test reagents, duct tape, plastic sheeting, a pry bar, padlocks, a hand cart. If I had learned anything from the first timeline, it was that the things people call boring are the things that keep a system alive. I started with the break room pantry because it was the easiest to justify. Shelf-stable soup, crackers, oatmeal cups, peanut butter, tea, coffee, granola bars, a box of plastic spoons, a case of electrolyte packets from the athletic club account that I knew nobody would miss for a week. I did not touch the frozen meals. I did not grab anything that needed a full kitchen. I took food that could be counted, stacked, and eaten cold if I had to. Then I went to the lab and checked our water testing supplies. Priya looked up when I came in and raised one eyebrow at the stack of bottles in my cart. "You planning for a snowstorm?" she asked. "Planning for people," I said. That made her stop sorting the sample vials. She was smart enough to hear the shape of the answer. I told her the truth in pieces. Hospital traffic was getting strange. Emergency calls were rising. The plant numbers had wobbled in my timeline just before everything went wrong. I did not say I had died. I did not say I had watched the bad end already. I just said I wanted the lab supplied before the week got noisy. Priya did not laugh at me. She did not promise anything dramatic either. She pulled out the inventory binder and helped me make a list of what would disappear first if delivery stopped. Turbidity standards, chlorine reagents, sample bottles, gloves, masks, alcohol wipes, replacement bulbs for the bench lamp, the spare battery pack for the portable meter. We both knew the pattern. A plant can look fully stocked right until the moment one small item becomes impossible to replace. By midday, I had made the first quiet run into town. I kept the route simple. Grocery store, pharmacy, hardware store, gas station, no detours, no side visits, no talking to anybody who looked like they were waiting for a story. The grocery store was already weird in that way. Early panic always is. Half the shoppers were buying normal things: milk, bread, fruit. The other half were buying the same shelf-stable foods I had already started loading into the cart. One man had 4 cases of bottled water stacked under his arm and looked embarrassed by it. A mother with 2 children had a cart full of canned soup, cereal, and paper towels and kept checking her phone like the screen might apologize for the day. I kept my purchases boring. Water cases, dry pasta, rice, canned beans, soup, paper goods, trash bags, a few jars of peanut butter, instant coffee, a box of powdered milk because I had learned from old outage seasons that even adults do better when they can make 1 hot drink per shift. The pharmacy counter was better or worse depending on how you measured it. I bought fever reducers, pain relievers, anti-diarrhea tablets, adhesive bandages, gauze, antiseptic, eye wash, gloves, masks, and a small bottle of iodine I did not expect to use but wanted anyway. I added a thermometer strip pack and a couple of saline rinses, because chlorine and dust can both make your eyes miserable when you're tired enough to stop blinking on time. The clerk asked if I was getting ready for a cold snap. I told her the weather had not decided yet. That was true enough. At the hardware store I bought batteries, 2 LED lanterns, 3 headlamps, zip ties, duct tape, heavy plastic sheeting, a pry bar, a hammer, pipe tape, and a folding handcart. I also bought a small pack of padlocks, because the plant had more locked doors than people who respected them. By the time I got back to the plant, the day shift was already talking about the hospital. Not in detail. in the careful way people talk when they have heard something bad but have not decided whether to believe it. Car accidents. Strange aggression. A patient in one of the East Side clinics had allegedly bitten a nurse. Another had attacked a security guard at a transit stop and kept moving after getting hit with a baton. The words came around the break room in fragments, washed down with coffee and disbelief. I listened without joining in. That was the first real difference between the new timeline and the old one. Last time, I had let the rumors pass until they became a problem right at my feet. This time, I heard the shape of the threat early enough to move while the plant still looked normal. Priya found me in the control room that evening while I was tightening the labels on the emergency shelves. She set a small stack of printouts on the desk. Residuals, flow rates, turbidity, pressure, the kind of paper that only matters when the numbers start changing too fast. "You look like you expect the power to fail," she said. "I expect something to fail," I said. She took that in, then glanced toward the window where the treatment hall lights were turning gold in the late sun. "Then we should probably act like it," she said. That was the first time she helped me move the extra bottled water into the control room wing. We stacked the cases along the inside wall, where they would not block the exit and would stay reachable in the dark. We moved the meds into the lower cabinet beneath the paperwork shelf. We brought the lanterns and batteries to the top drawer of the desk and taped the generator contact numbers to the front of the monitor where nobody could miss them. By the end of the shift, the control room had changed from an office into a core zone. The lab became the verification zone. The break room became the rest zone. The corridor to the generator room became the line I wanted nobody crossing without reason. I shut the lights off one by one and listened to the plant settle. The hum of the pumps, the soft tick in the pipe braces, the low electronic whisper of the control boards, the lonely clink of a cup in the sink when the air handler kicked on. Nothing had gone wrong yet. That was the dangerous part. Every real disaster starts by allowing you one more ordinary night than you deserve. At 1:40 a.m., the first outside alert came through the county channel. There had been violent incidents near the hospital and transit corridor. Emergency personnel were being asked to remain flexible. Traffic around the west suburbs was being rerouted. The water plant was not named, but I could hear the shape of the next hour in the message. Priya came into the control room with a pen in her mouth and a frown on her face. "We just got a second lab note from the hospital system," she said. "They want sample backup and they want it fast." "How bad?" I asked. She gave me the kind of look that means a person does not have a calm answer. "Bad enough that they are asking for paper records." That made the back of my neck tighten. Paper records means somebody no longer trusts the network. I reached for the radio. Before I touched the transmit key, the control room lights flickered once. Then they flickered again. The third flicker was longer. Down in the treatment hall, one of the pump motors changed pitch for a second and then leveled off. The sound was small, but I noticed it because I was listening with the memory of a corpse. Power instability. The first wave was starting. I told Priya to stay near the lab and keep the sample bench ready. Then I called Hank Delaney on the maintenance channel. He answered on the first ring, voice rough with sleep and the kind of irritation only a man with 30 years of mechanical habits can manage without waking up fully. "If you are calling this early, the plant better be on fire," he said. "Not yet," I told him, "but I want you here when the generator gets the idea." He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "I'm on my way." I looked back at the plant log and saw the pressure line dip another fraction. The numbers were beginning to tell the truth. Hank reached the plant 20 minutes later with a tool bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. He was the kind of superintendent who looked born with a wrench in his pocket. Gray hair, heavy shoulders, permanent squint, and the exhausted patience of a man who had spent most of his life making pumps behave. He walked through the control room, listened to the generator hum, and did not waste time asking whether the power issue was real. "Show me the trend," he said. I handed him the screen log. He studied the dips, scratched the side of his jaw, and nodded once. "Not a coincidence," he said. "That was Hank's version of a warning." We went down to the generator room together. The air in there was hotter than the rest of the plant and always smelled like diesel even when nothing was leaking. The backup unit was holding, but the voltage readout had started to flutter in that ugly way that means a machine is carrying more load than it wants. Hank opened the panel, checked the transfer switch, and told me one line was drawing a little too hard. "The plant can live with this," he said. "It just can't keep pretending it doesn't know the load is climbing." I cut the non-essential lights and reduced one of the auxiliary systems. The hum settled a little. Priya joined us with a clipboard, a sample vial, and her hair pinned back so tight it looked like she had not slept since last season. She held the vial up to the light. "Finished water is still within range," she said. "Raw water is not as happy. Turbidity is nudging up. Nothing catastrophic yet." "Yet," Hank said. Priya gave him a flat look. "That was a technical term," she said. "It should have been funny. In another week it would have been." We spent the next hour doing the sort of maintenance that only looks small from the outside. I checked the chlorine feed. Hank checked the transfer switch. Priya verified the lab meter against a backup standard. We moved the spare reagent bottles away from the warm wall and labeled the cabinet door with a strip of tape so nobody would have to guess where the clean samples went. Then the lights in the west wing flickered out. Not the whole plant. Just the west wing first, which was almost worse because it made the failure feel selective and therefore more personal. The break room went dark. One hallway strip light stayed on for a second longer than it should have, and then died too. I heard the alarm tone from the screen panel before I saw the message. "Utility interruption detected. Automatic transfer to backup in progress." That was the moment the first wave stopped being rumor and became job. I moved before I thought. Hank was already halfway down the hall toward the generator room. Priya grabbed the paper log and the portable meter. I shut the non-essential systems, locked the lab cabinet, and took the flashlight from the drawer where I had left it on purpose. The generator caught after one ugly cough. Then it settled into a rougher, heavier hum than before. The control room lights came back, but the edges of the room had shifted into a softer glow that made everything feel more temporary. Temporary is a dangerous word in a crisis because it tricks people into postponing decisions. Not this time. I went to the gate camera and pulled up the exterior feed. The service lot was wet with a thin layer of sleet. One delivery truck sat crooked at the curb with its hazard lights still blinking. Nobody was in the cab. The road beyond the fence had a line of stopped cars stretching toward the suburb, and I could see people moving around them in that disjointed way crowds do when they are trying to choose between waiting and leaving. Carla Vega called the plant on the emergency line 10 minutes later. She identified herself before I could ask. County Emergency Coordination. West Metro Access Control. Temporary traffic restriction around the plant corridor. Her voice was crisp and controlled, and that mattered because every calm person on a radio is one more thing keeping the day from tipping over. She told me there had been confirmed violent incidents near the hospital, and that the county was moving to restrict movement around the utility corridor until they knew what was spreading and where. I asked if the plant was considered a target. There was a pause. Then she said, "Not yet, but people are already asking about water." That answered more than she probably meant it to. By morning, the suburb had started behaving like a place that had heard half the truth and was building its own version of the rest. Traffic moved badly. The radio stations repeated the same safety advisories with different music in between. People called the plant office asking whether the water was safe, whether the pressure drop they felt was real, whether the hospital situation had anything to do with the taps, whether they should fill bathtubs or jugs or every cup in the house. I did not give anybody a speech. I gave them facts. The water was running. The finished water samples were within range. The plant was under active monitoring. If the county issued a boil advisory or a restriction, we would follow it. Facts are not soothing, but they are honest. Priya helped me set up the first official logboard in the office corridor. Date, time, raw water turbidity, finished water chlorine residual, generator load, fuel level, complaint calls, any abnormal note from the gates. Hank added one more line beneath the others. If the power fails again, the first priority is control room, lab, generator, chemical cage. I underlined it twice. The blackout came that evening just after sunset. This time the entire west corridor went dead at once, followed by the intake building lights and then the outer yard lamps. The generator took the load but groaned under it. I heard the relays click, one after another, like teeth closing. Priya was halfway through a test when the bench light cut out. She did not panic. She just reached for the headlamp hanging on the lab hook and kept working. Hank stayed in the generator room long enough to check the coolant and make sure the transfer switch had actually seated. I stayed in the control room and watched the plant become a series of small lit islands separated by dark hallways. The sound outside changed too. The suburb made a different noise when the power dropped. Car alarms. Distant shouting. One sharp crash from somewhere beyond the fence line. Then a silence so wide it made every little electrical buzz inside the building seem louder. Carla called again an hour later. The county had shifted from traffic control to partial lockdown. No non-essential travel. No public gatherings near critical infrastructure. Stay inside if possible. Treat any unexplained bite or violent behavior as a medical emergency and keep distance. It was almost ordinary language. Almost. Priya came into the control room with the portable meter and said the latest finished water sample was still okay, but the raw water had climbed enough to make her want a second check. Turbidity rose after storms. Turbidity also rose when people did ugly things upstream, and the runoff carried the consequences into the system. I looked at the reservoir feed line on the screen. There was a little wobble in the trend. Not huge, but enough to make my stomach tighten. "We need to hold through the night," I said. Hank, who had come back smelling like diesel and warm dust, nodded from the doorway. "That's the job," he said. It would have been easier if the trouble had stopped at the plant walls. It did not. By the next morning, people had started arriving at the front gate asking for water. At first they came politely. A couple with refillable jugs, a father and teenage son with a wagon, an older woman holding a stack of plastic bottles like she had walked too far with every one of them and could not afford to spill even one drop. I sent them to the emergency distribution point at the city side where the county workers were setting up controlled pickup. Then the requests got less polite. The questions changed. Why was the plant still closed? Why was the city keeping the clean water inside? Why were some houses losing pressure while others still had water? Why did the hospital need more than anybody else? The answer was that the system was still running, but systems do not satisfy fear. Fear wants a hand to grab. Hank suggested we secure the chain link behind the front gate and move the extra bottled water deeper into the office wing. Priya agreed and added that if the crowd got angry enough, the lab needed to be hidden from the outer windows. That was practical. We taped the office glass, lowered the blinds, moved the visible cases of water out of sight, and put a sign on the front entry that said water distributed by county order only. The sign did not reduce the shouting. It did, however, make the boundary clear enough that Carla could back us up over the radio. She called around midday and told me the county had no spare people for the gate, but they would send a patrol if the crowd became a breach risk. I asked her what counted as a breach risk. "Use your judgment," she said. That was not the answer I wanted. It was the answer that meant she was already overloaded. The water problem deepened on day 3. The chlorine stock dropped lower than I liked, not because we had wasted it, but because the plant was running harder to compensate for the raw water instability and the distribution system had begun taking odd pressure swings from the suburban demand curve. Every time one neighborhood pulled a little harder, another one felt the loss. Priya reran the samples twice. The results stayed within acceptable limits, but the margins were narrowing. Hank wanted to increase the generator runtime and keep the valves on hand control more often, which would protect the system but burn fuel faster. I wanted to keep the plant operating the way it had been designed to operate, because improvisation is how a treatment plant turns into a rumor. Priya settled the argument by pointing at the lab trend and telling us that a water plant is not a philosophy seminar. "We do the thing that keeps the numbers safe," she said. That ended it. We shut off the unnecessary office lights, reduced the break room power draw, and moved the sample bench supplies into a tighter, more protected row. Then the first infected reached the fence line outside the plant. I saw it on the camera. One man in a work jacket, walking in a direction that made no sense because he kept drifting toward the chain link, and then correcting, and then drifting back. His head was tilted strangely. One sleeve was wet with something dark that had already started to dry on the cuff. He was not fast. He was not alone for long. A second figure came into frame behind him. Then a third. None of them moved like healthy people making a choice. They moved like damaged bodies that still remembered how to follow a sound. The front gate held. The crowd outside did not like that. Someone shouted that they had children in the neighborhood. Someone else shouted for the plant to open. One person hammered the gate with both hands until the chain link rattled. I stayed in the control room and kept the door locked. Hank stood at my shoulder, eyes on the camera feed. Priya took one look at the growing line of people outside and started moving the sample papers to the back shelf. Nobody said the thing we were all thinking. If the infected reached the wrong side of the fence, the plant would stop being a utility and become a shelter people fought over. That was the shape of the danger. Not one problem. 2. The dead outside the fence and the living people who would make a bad decision to avoid them. By evening, the county sirens had started testing the corridor routes in the west suburbs. Carla came through on the radio with a strained but controlled voice and told us that a formal safe corridor was being planned around the plant district. Controlled lanes, checkpoints, sample verification, limited escort. I asked when. She said not yet. That was enough to know that it was coming, which was better than pretending otherwise. I taped the corridor notice to the wall beside the logboard and wrote a smaller note beneath it for myself. Keep the plant alive long enough for help to become a route. That was the only job that mattered now. And the whole place smelled of bleach, wet concrete, and the first sharp edge of fear. The chemical shortage showed itself the same way all practical shortages do, by making the important things slightly harder before it makes it impossible. On day 4, the chlorine feed room had one drum left that I trusted and one that I did not want to trust for more than a shift. The backup reagent for the bench test was down to the last sealed box. The hand labels on the spare meter batteries were already fading from the heat in the cabinet. Priya spread the inventory out on the lab table and tapped the empty spaces with a pen, as if the missing items might return if she pointed at them long enough. If the road stays closed, we have a week if we are careful, she said. If we are not careful, I asked. She did not look up. Then less. That was enough. Hank said the generator fuel could hold if we reduced the non-essential load and stopped pretending the office needed to feel comfortable. I agreed. Comfort is a trap when you're measuring runtime. We turned off the extra monitor in the break room, cut power to the decorative lobby signage, and switched the office lights to the lower emergency setting. The plant became a place of narrow cones of brightness and long dark edges. The smell in the chemical corridor changed too. Chlorine always has a smell, but when the feed room gets hot and the doors stay closed too long, the odor sharpens until it feels almost physical. I checked the fittings twice, then again, and tightened the valve cap just enough to reassure myself without overdoing it. Every pipe in that room had a job. Every valve had a way to become a problem if fear made a person touch it wrong. Carla called around noon with the first detailed corridor sketch. She did not send a paper map. She read the route to me over the radio in the clipped language of somebody trying to keep 3 agencies from arguing about the same road. There would be a check-in lane at the west access road. 1 lane only. No public crowding around the plant gate. No self-directed traffic. Water plant staff would be marked for controlled movement because the county wanted utility workers able to reach the corridor site and keep the plant online if the road stayed open. I asked her whether the plant was expected to keep serving water during the evacuation. She said yes. Then she said, "That is why I'm calling you first." That mattered more than I wanted it to. The outside run happened at first light on day 5. Priya wanted test reagents from the medical supply warehouse on the north edge of the suburb. Hank wanted valve grease, pipe tape, and a replacement relay from the hardware distributor near the freight corridor. I wanted batteries, masks, and 1 more sealed box of sample jars from the lab supply store before we depended on the remaining stock. We took 1 county vehicle and 1 plant utility truck because the road conditions were bad enough that moving in a pair felt safer than pretending 1 vehicle could do everything. The suburb had gone gray in a way that made normal morning traffic look like a memory. Abandoned minivans sat at odd angles near the curb. The traffic lights at 2 intersections blinked on backup and then failed entirely. Yard sprinklers kept running in 1 neighborhood where nobody had gone outside to notice them. A broken shopping cart lay tipped on its side in a slanted driveway. I saw a woman on a 2nd-floor porch holding a dog leash in 1 hand and a phone in the other, trying to decide which emergency mattered first. We did not stop. We moved by side roads and service lanes because the main streets were already too clogged with stalled cars and people looking for fuel. At the first warehouse, we found the front entry half barricaded from the inside. That is not a good sign. It means the people there were scared enough to make a wall before they were scared enough to leave. Hank pried the side door open with the kind of steady force that only old mechanics can make look calm. Inside, the aisles were dark and smelled like cardboard dust, spilled sanitizer, and a cooler full of spoiled food near the brake counter. We moved quickly and touched as little as possible. I took box after box of batteries, a new pack of headlamps, and 2 sealed containers of test strips. Priya found the reagent kit on a shelf in the back and exhaled through her nose like she had been holding her breath since we left the plant. Hank got the relay and the pipe tape and added a tin of grease with the kind of satisfaction men get when they find the exact part they feared would be missing. On the way out, we heard a thump from the stockroom. We froze. The sound came again, then stopped. I looked through the crack in the side door and saw only shelving and a rolling ladder. Whatever was in there, if anything was in there, was still behind the walls and not yet our problem. We left before curiosity could become a second mistake. The pharmacy stop was worse, because the pharmacy still looked like a place that should have been safe. The front windows were intact, the shelves were half full, the lights were on a backup strip. But the waiting area chairs had been shoved against the inner counter from the inside, and the smell of alcohol wipes and fear was so strong it made the place feel already occupied by panic. The pharmacist handed us a small bag of sterile gloves, antiseptic, and a handful of over-the-counter meds without asking many questions. She just looked at our county badges, looked at our tired faces, and said, "Take what you need and keep the line moving." That was one of the better sentences I heard that week. On the way back to the plant, the first crowd problem found us. It was not an infected crowd yet. It was living people who had decided the water plant was the last place left with something useful inside. About a dozen people had gathered near the outer fence, some with jugs, some with buckets, some with nothing but anger and the hope that shouting would make a locked gate reconsider. A father with a kid on his hip was trying to get past the line because he said his wife was sick and he needed clean water now. An older man was arguing that the county had no right to hold water behind a fence when neighborhoods were drying out. Someone else was demanding to speak to a supervisor. I parked the truck inside the inner lot and went to the camera monitor. Carla was already on the emergency channel. "Do not open the gate," she said immediately. "We have a containment issue 2 streets over." "Meaning what?" I asked. She paused just long enough for me to understand the answer before she gave it. "Meaning infected movement is in the area. Keep your doors locked." That was the end of the discussion. I keyed the gate speaker and told the crowd that water distribution would be handled by county order at the designated point and not from the plant fence. The father with the child begged. The older man cursed me. One woman said we were hoarding. I could see their faces in the camera feed. And I knew that if we opened the gate even once, we would never close it again without blood or worse. So I did the hardest simple thing. I did not move. The infected arrived at the far edge of the street less than 10 minutes later. Not a swarm, not a wave. Just 2 of them at first, drifting out from behind an abandoned SUV with the wrong sort of purpose in their steps. They were slow enough that a healthy person could have crossed the road and left them behind. They were also close enough to turn the human crowd into a panic. The father ran first. The older man ran second. The woman with the empty bucket threw it down and followed the others. One person slipped on the wet curb and got dragged up by another, and the whole fence line broke into motion as if fear itself had found a body. I stayed at the camera and watched the infected keep moving forward while the living people scattered away from the plant and toward the side roads. Hank came up beside me and said, "That could have been worse." He was right. That did not make it feel better. The gate stayed locked. Priya locked the lab door from the inside and turned off the bench light so the windows would not show movement. I moved the bottled water cases deeper into the control room wing and put the padlock on the office cabinet that held the spare keys and the paper forms. The plant had officially crossed from utility to fortified system. That night, the suburb's boil water rumor grew so loud that the county had to answer it on the public channel. They did not issue a blanket boil order yet. They did issue a cautionary notice about pressure instability, potential service interruptions, and the importance of following official updates. Translation: if you knew how to read the language, the system is still functioning. Do not make it worse. Do not assume your own tap is lying less than the one next door. Priya and I spent 3 straight hours sampling and resampling the finished water to make sure the numbers were not drifting under the new load. Chlorine residual stayed acceptable. Turbidity rose and settled. Pressure dipped and came back. Every time one of the values moved, I felt a small cold tighten in the center of my chest. We were still alive because the reading stayed on the right side of the line. That was all. I wrote the final results in the log and set the paper under the monitor where Carla would see it if she came by. The plant smell had changed by then. Less coffee, more bleach, more diesel, more hot electronics, more wet concrete from the boots coming in and out of the service corridor. That is the smell of a system being held together on purpose. And for the first time since the reset, I understood that the water plant might actually survive if we could keep the humans outside the fence from turning it into a public argument. The next problem came from the filter backwash line. I found it at 2:20 a.m. on day 6, when the alarm panel gave me a short, sharp tone and the flow trend on the second filter bank dipped in a way that made no sense at first glance. I was alone in the control room while Hank checked the intake screen and Priya was in the lab comparing sample notes. That was deliberate. We had learned not to crowd every problem just because the plant was tense. The backwash pump had not failed completely. It had just begun to lose efficiency. That is worse than an obvious failure because it tempts you to wait. I called Hank back to the hall and we opened the panel together. One coupler had worked loose enough to vibrate under load, but not enough to trigger a hard shutdown. The kind of failure that hides under normal noise until the plant is already under strain. Hank cursed softly, not at the machine, but at the timing of it. I hate problems that behave politely, he said. I handed him the wrench and held the light. The fix took 18 minutes and a second check with the torque marker. Priya brought the sample log into the corridor and waited while we finished. When the pump came back up, the line stabilized again. That was the sort of win that would have seemed tiny to anyone outside the plant. To us, it felt like getting one more night of sleep in the middle of a fight. Priya gave me a careful look after the numbers settled. "You were expecting that," she said. "I was expecting something," I said. She did not ask how I could tell. I was tired of explaining the parts of my second chance that sounded impossible even to me. Instead, I showed her the row of log entries I had kept from the old timeline, the ones I had rewritten from memory into the notebook because I needed the sequence in front of me. Generator issue, gate pressure, chlorine drift, backwash instability, corridor announcement. It all lined up too neatly to be comforting and too neatly to be coincidence. Priya read the pages once, then set the notebook down and said, very quietly, "Then we do not waste what you already know." That became the rule. We stopped arguing over whether the outbreak was real. We already knew it was. We stopped hoping the county would cleanly solve every problem. It would not. We stopped treating each alarm as if it might be the only one. There would always be another. What mattered was whether the water stayed clean and whether the plant stayed controlled long enough for the county corridor to reach us. Carla came in person on day 7. She arrived with 2 county security officers, a rolled route map, and the look of a woman who had not slept enough to be polite. She wore a reflective vest over her uniform and had dust on the knees of her pants from kneeling beside a barricade somewhere else. She did not waste time on pleasantries. The corridor, she said, would open first to essential workers and verified family groups. The plant would remain online. Water distribution from the county trucks would start at the lower access point once the route was cleared. No one was to improvise movement. No one was to leave the plant by the back gate without escort. She laid the route map on the control room desk. It looked simple in black marker. Too simple. A line from the west checkpoint to the municipal loading lane to the lower holding site. I asked her if the route had been tested. She said yes. I asked her if infected movement was still nearby. She said yes again. That honesty was more useful than comfort. Carla checked the logboard and asked if the plant had stayed within range since the last sample. Priya answered before I did. "Stable," she said. "Not generous. Stable." Carla nodded once like that was exactly the word she wanted. "Then keep it that way," she said. After she left, we prepared for the corridor like a plant prepares for an emergency flush. No drama. No wasted motion. Every item had a place. The bottled water cases went to the front corridor for loading. The paper records were boxed and labeled. The lab equipment was wrapped in plastic. The generator fuel was checked one more time. The emergency radios were tested on low power. The sample cooler was packed with the last sterile bottles and the cleanest notes Priya had written. Hank found one more issue in the chemical cage door and fixed it before it became important. I watched him work and felt, for the first time in days, the simple relief of a problem being small enough to solve on time. The last outside crowd formed at the fence on the evening before the corridor opened. This one was quieter than the first. Tired faces. Empty hands. People who had already spent their fear in other places. Some wanted water. Some wanted instructions. One man simply asked whether the county route would still be open in the morning if he waited by the West Road with his mother. I could not promise him anything except the current plan. Carla had warned us that the corridor would not hold if people wandered off the marked lanes, so I gave him the truth. If he stayed at the checkpoint, he had a better chance than if he wandered the suburbs alone. He nodded once and went back toward the road. The infected pressure never became a full breach, but it came close enough to make the night feel thin. One figure appeared at the far edge of the service access road just after midnight, then another. They were slow, but the movement was wrong enough to catch the security camera automatically. Carla radioed the patrol pair stationed at the lower lane. One of the county officers stepped out with a flashlight and a shield, while the other signaled traffic to hold. I watched the camera feed and saw the infected drift toward the light, then stop, then drift again as if sound were the only thing guiding it. The county team handled it without panic. That mattered more than heroics would have. They did not sprint, they did not scatter. They kept the lane clear and pushed the infected away from the road long enough for the route to stay open. Priya came into the control room after that and said the lab water test had cleared again. Residual stable. Turbidity low enough. No unusual odor. Clear enough for distribution under county order. I read the sheet twice, then a third time because I wanted the numbers to stay put. Hank let out a long breath I had not realized he was holding. There it is, he said. There it was. The next morning, before sunrise, the corridor opened. The last night before that corridor opened lasted longer than the rest of the week. It did not last longer in the clock sense. The clock was fine. It lasted longer in the way a final watch always does when you know the next morning has to work, or nothing else matters. Every sound became a decision. Every light check became a habit you could not afford to skip. Every small failure looked like it might be the one that ruined the only clean route left in the suburb. I stayed in the control room while Hank did a final walk of the generator room and Priya reran the last sample from the finished water tap. The plant hummed around us in the low, stubborn tone I had learned to love and hate at the same time. The pump stayed on. The pressure held. The chlorine residual remained within the safe line. On paper, that should have been enough to let me relax. In practice, it just gave me one more thing to protect. Priya came back from the lab with the sample sheet and set it on the desk without speaking for a full second. When she finally did speak, she said, "Still clean." I looked at the numbers anyway. Then I looked at them again. I had learned from the first timeline that a person can mistake relief for clearance and miss the one value that matters. This time the numbers were where they should be. No hidden drift. No silent contamination. No ugly surprise waiting behind the last column. Hank came in from the generator room with his hands smelling of diesel and cold metal. "Fuel holds for the next stretch," he said. "If the corridor is open on time, we hand the plant off without having to beg the machine for anything extra." That was as close to good news as he ever got. Carla called once more before midnight. She was short on patience and long on control, which meant the route was likely real and the pressure around it was still ugly. She told me the first convoy would enter the west lane after dawn. Essential staff first, family groups second, emergency medical loads third. No wandering, no loose movement. No one should assume the corridor was safer than the plant simply because it was official. I said I understood. She asked if the plant was still online. I told her yes. She did not say thank you. She just marked the answer down and moved on to the next call, which was exactly the right way to use her voice. Around 1 in the morning, a small crowd gathered again at the far end of the service road. This time it was quieter. Fewer people, fewer arguments. They had already been told about the morning corridor and had chosen to wait nearby instead of making their own bad plans somewhere else in the dark. A man with a duffel bag sat on the curb and stared at the ground as if he could force it to give him a better answer. 2 women shared a blanket around their shoulders. One older teenager kept checking the road and pretending not to be scared when the headlights swept past. I watched them from the camera feed and let myself feel something close to pity without turning it into action. There was nothing useful to do for them except keep the route clear. That was a hard lesson to like. Priya brought a mug of coffee to the control desk and set it beside my keyboard. It had gone lukewarm by the time I drank half of it, but it still tasted like the first honest thing I had had in hours. "You keep looking at the clock," she said. "Because if I stop, I will start looking at the fence," I said. She nodded once. That was all the agreement we needed. At the lab, she sealed the final sample boxes with tape and wrote the chain of custody labels in careful block letters. The packets looked ordinary, which is what made them valuable. In a week full of dead phones, broken routes, and locked doors, a stack of labeled sample boxes felt almost formal. Hank rechecked the chemical cage door for the third time. I watched him do it and understood the habit completely. You check the things you can still touch because touching them is easier than waiting for bigger trouble to arrive. The outside road made a brief noise near dawn. Not a shout, not a crash. Just a distant engine, then another, and the faint crunch of tires on wet pavement. That sound mattered enough to bring all three of us to the front windows. Through the taped glass, we could see the first county vehicles moving into position under the portable lamps. Reflective jackets, flashing lights, one truck carrying water pallets, another holding a barricade line. A third carrying the kind of people who had learned to manage a corridor instead of just announcing one. The plant looked different from that angle. Not safe, not fixed, just temporarily aligned with the outside world in a way that made it possible for both sides to trust the same lane. A teenager on the far curb stood up when the convoy arrived and then sat back down again before doing anything stupid. That tiny act of restraint felt like a victory by itself. Priya took another sample from the finished water tap and held it to the light. Still clear, she said. I noticed that her voice had changed a little by then. Less tight, not relaxed. Just less likely to fracture if somebody asked the wrong question. Hank leaned against the doorway and said, "That is the closest we get to a miracle in this line of work." He was not wrong. The plant had been threatened by all the usual things. Human panic, mechanical failure, lost power, chemical shortage, fear at the gates. Every one of those could have shut us down if I had been a week slower or a little less stubborn. But the numbers held because the people inside the plant kept doing specific work in a specific order. That is what I kept thinking during the last quiet hour. Water plants are not brave, they are not noble, they are not even especially dramatic. They are systems that work if enough people refuse to let the small failures stack into a large one. The corridor crew radioed in at 5:32 a.m. to confirm the lane was clear. I wrote the time down. Then I copied the current chlorine residual, the turbidity reading, the generator load, and the fuel level one last time into the top sheet of the log. I wanted a clean record of the moment the plant stopped being a siege and became a functioning utility again. Not because anyone would frame it, because I wanted to remember the numbers. The last thing that almost went wrong was a simple one. The break room faucet gave one ugly spit of brown water before clearing. Priya saw it first and called for the tap to be isolated. Hank checked the line. I shut the branch valve and wrote the note into the maintenance log. Minor discoloration on branch line, cleared after flush, no effect on finished water sample. That is the sort of sentence that would bore almost anybody else in the world. To me, it was proof that the plant still spoke in the language I understood. We did one final walk through the control room wing before dawn. The shelves were still in place. The bottled water cases were still stacked in rows. The sample cooler was still cold. The padlock on the cabinet held. The taped windows had not peeled. The corridor to the generator room remained clear. I stood in the narrow hallway and listened to the building breathe. That sound had gotten me through 6 years of night shifts and 1 week of the end of the world. The pumps hummed. The relays clicked. The generator held its note. Somewhere outside, the convoy lamps washed the fence line in a pale yellow light. Priya came up beside me and said, very quietly, "After this, I want a night with no alarms." Hank snorted from the generator door. "That would be suspicious," he said. It was the sort of deadpan answer that only a tired mechanic can deliver without trying. I laughed once. Not because anything was funny in the clean, ordinary sense. Just because the sound of it meant the pressure in my chest had finally started to move. Then Carla radioed the final go-ahead. The corridor was open. The plant still smelled like bleach, diesel, wet concrete, and the stale coffee we had all forgotten to finish. The control room still had taped windows. The lab still had a stack of sample logs. The generator still hummed with the same tired patience. The difference was that the county trucks were now waiting at the lower access point, and the marked lane outside the fence was lit by portable lights and watched by people whose job was to keep the route narrow and honest. Carla met us at the front entry with a clipboard and a face that had not softened much but had lost some of its tension. She reviewed our names. She checked the records box. She confirmed the water test. She pointed to the loading lane and told us the plant staff would move first, then the family groups, then the distribution line. Nothing in her voice sounded triumphant. That was better. Triumph gets people careless. Priya carried the lab case. Hank carried the maintenance binder and the spare relay wrapped in cloth. I carried the notebook, the keys, the sample cooler, and the small legal pad where I had written the plant counts from the week that had not happened twice yet and still had somehow changed my life. We moved the way plant workers move when they are trying not to spill anything important. Careful. Measured. No wasted steps. At the lower lane, a county worker checked the water case labels and told the truck crew to start loading the first pallets. The boxes went up with the clean clunk of plastic against metal. One of the family groups waiting by the lane was the same older woman I had seen earlier in the week with the stack of bottles. She looked thinner now, more tired, but she was alive and standing in line instead of arguing with a fence. That felt like enough proof that the plan had worked at least once. Before I left the plant yard, I looked back at the control room wing. The blinds were still down. The taped glass still looked dull and patched. The lab window caught a bit of morning light and threw it back in a pale square. I could almost see the hours we had spent inside that building as if they were stacked in the air. Inventory, samples, repairs, locked doors. One more test. One more check. One more night. Hank stood beside me with his hands in his jacket pockets and said the plant would need a full crew and a full supply run before it was truly comfortable again. Comfort is not the job, I told him. He snorted. No, he said, but it is a nice rumor. Priya was already halfway to the truck when she turned back long enough to call, "If the samples stay clean, I want the first normal coffee after this." I told her that sounded like an acceptable recovery plan. She gave the smallest smile and kept walking. The corridor itself was simple once it opened. That was the strange part. No grand music. No sense that the whole world had been fixed. Just a narrow lane, a few officers, a waiting line of people, and a plant that had held on long enough to become useful again instead of contested. I stepped into the marked route with my bag on my shoulder and the notebook tucked under one arm, and I felt the first real release in my chest since the day I had reset in the control room. Not joy, not even relief yet. Just the end of the worst pressure. That was enough. The water plant still stood behind me when I left. The pumps were still running. The lab was still open. The generator was still warm from the night. The suburb was still broken in enough places to keep the next week hard. But the core crisis had been solved. The water was clean. The corridor was open. The plant had not fallen. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself walk without listening for my own death behind me.